I'm Dee Williams, and I just want to welcome everybody to the NAACP's Lunch and Learn. This is the NAACP Criminal Justice Committee that's put this on with Ian Mance. And to bring the welcome, I'd like for Carmen Ramos Kennedy, our chapter president for Asheville branch of the NAACP, to come give a welcome to.
Forgive me. First of all, I'm blown away. It is amazing to see this number of people here. We have the right person for the right job, Dee Williams. Let's give her a I've met with Dee a few times before we really got engaged in a number of things, but one of the things that she brought to me, she goes, Carmen, we really need to have something as part of a criminal justice aspect in the NAACP. While we've always had a committee that stands like that, we've had no one that was willing to man it, to chair it. And Dee was the person that was willing to do that. And I so lift her up because she is phenomenal. And I thank you all for the work you're doing. And Code North Carolina, oh my God, thank you guys. So I want to thank the Asheville Police Department for showing up and repping. It's important. This is important information. All of our community allies, thank you so much. I'm not going to talk because we need to get going. So
thank you so much, Carmen. I'm going to be very brief. I just want to sort of give you a purpose of why we're here, and Carmen did. She told you how we started this committee. And as a matter of fact, there was a call to action from the national NAACP for all chapters to start taking a look at criminal justice reform. So this is why we've started this committee, and that's why we do its work. It's from that call to action and the director from the national NAACP. I want to tell you just a little bit about Ian's organization, which is statewide, well, really it extends beyond statewide. It's a Southern Coalition for Social Justice. It's a 501c3 nonprofit founded in August 2007 in Durham, North Carolina, by a multidisciplinary group, predominantly people of color, who believe that families and communities engaged in social justice struggles need a team of lawyers, social scientists, community organizers, and media specialists to support them in their efforts to dismantle structural racism and oppression. Some of the areas are protection of minority voting rights and strengthening meaningful opportunities for effective civic participation for all, advancing environmental justice and advocacy, supporting community-driven efforts, challenging racial discrimination at all stages of the criminal justice system and its impact on racial and ethnic minority communities, and ending discrimination against immigrants and the mistreatment of undocumented persons. So I want to give you their mission statement, and then I'll begin with the introduction of Ian. The Southern Coalition for Social Justice partners with communities of color and economic disadvantaged communities in the South to defend and advance their political, social, and economic rights through the combination of legal advocacy, research, organizing, and communications. So that's the mission statement. And last but not least, a very impressive young man. Don't let the baby face fool you. Ian Mance. Ian A. Mance is a staff attorney with Southern Coalition's Criminal Justice Reform Team. He first joined Southern Coalition for Social Justice in 2013 by way of Soros Justice Fellowship from the Open Society Foundations, during which he focused on utilizing traffic stop data to challenge racial profiling practices by law enforcement. His efforts working with community organizers in Durham helped lead to a formal finding of, quote, racial bias and racial profiling, end quote, by the Durham Police Department, and a series of policy reforms aimed at deterring abusive stop and search practices. As a staff attorney, Mance's practice includes cases involving police misconduct, prison conditions, and wrongful convictions. He also leads SCSJ's, which is Southern Coalition, Open Data Policing Initiative, and that's what we're here today. Mance graduated with honors from the UNC School of Law, where he served as articles editor for the North Carolina Law Review, and as a certified student practitioner in UNC Civil Legal Assistance Clinic. While at UNC Clinic, Mance represented a group of 8 men in a federal excessive force lawsuit that resulted in changes to a maximum security prison solitary confinement unit aimed at improving unit safety and officer accountability. From 2006 to 2010, Mance worked as a program associate at the Raleigh office of the American Civil Liberties Union, where he coordinated a campaign that led to the reform of use of force policies in 18 North Carolina Sheriff's Departments statewide and provided assistance to the legal and racial justice programs. Prior to his time at ACLU, he served as shelter manager of the Hospitality House, Northwestern, North Carolina's only homeless shelter. He also has worked for the UNC Center for Civil Rights, the Durham firm of Rock and Nice, PA, where he focused on civil rights and criminal cases, bond investigations, a private detective agency, and Motley Rights LLC, one of the nation's largest plaintiffs' litigation firms. Mance is a former National Board member of Students for Sensible Drug Policy and has long been active in the movement for drug policy reform. He has also been active in efforts to promote accountability for police abuse of electronic weapons. His 2013 articles, Power Down, Tasers, the Fourth Amendment, and Police Accountability in the Fourth Circuit, was published in volume 91 of the North Carolina Law Review. In 2008, he co-authored the ACLU report, Not There Yet, The Need for Safer Taser Policies in North Carolina, which surveyed taser-related deaths in the state and taser use of force policy in all 100 counties. Mance holds master's and bachelor's degrees in political science and criminal justice, respectively, from Appalachian State University, so up in these mountains. He was born and raised in Charleston. And without further ado, I give you Ian Mance.
Very much. I'm happy to be here today. Like he said, I'm going to talk about traffic stops today. One of the things I do in my job is partner with community groups around the state that are interested in learning more about traffic stop and search practices in their communities. So North Carolina is a unique state, as I'm going to go into. We were the first state in the country to make this data available. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of the statute, what sort of information is collected, what various communities in North Carolina have done with this information in the last couple of years since it's become more widely available, different types of applications that this data has, and then I'm going to end by taking a look at Asheville's traffic stop data, talking about how it compares to other similarly sized cities, and then the NAACP had asked that I discuss a few no-cost policy proposals that could be implemented that have been done in other communities around the state that have been shown to be effective in reducing the racial disparities that really exist in every community. So I should start by saying this is nothing unique to Asheville, what I'm about to say. You could really say what I'm about to say about just about any community in North Carolina. So this is all kind of part of what we call the Open Data Policing Initiative. And we work not just with community groups, but also directly with police agencies. So we've got good working relationships with a number of police departments throughout the state that have expressed an interest in using data to improve the quality of policing in their community. But our goal in the end is really to promote racial equity, to reduce these disparities over time so that traffic stops and searches mirror what we would expect given the residential population. North Carolina, as I said, was the first state in the United States to pass a data collection law. It passed back in April 1999. It went into effect in January 2000 for the State Highway Patrol. And then in January 1st, 2002, all other state police departments and sheriff's offices had to start reporting their data, provided that they policed a jurisdiction of more than 10,000 people. So we've got about close to 400 reporting agencies in North Carolina, most of which have now been reporting their data for about 15 years. So this is the statute where you can, if you're interested in kind of scrutinizing it and learning more about it, this is where you can find it. And this is just part of the statute. But to kind of sum it up, the way it works is that every time the traffic stop is made in North Carolina, with the exception of traffic stops made pursuant to checkpoints, so DWI checkpoints and things like that are not included. But every other traffic stop, officers fill out a form. It's called SBI 122 form. It was originally all paper, and over the last decade, many departments have switched to computers. So it's just kind of automated. But each traffic stop generates up to 41 different data points, including the race of the driver stop, the age of the driver stop, the gender, what was the purpose of the stop, was there a search conducted in the stop? If there was a search, was it a consent search? Was it a probable cause search? Was it a search incident to arrest? What was the legal justification for the search? Was anything found in the search? Was the passenger searched? What were the demographic characteristics of the passenger? Was there force used in the course of the stop? And if so, was the force initiated by someone in the vehicle or by the officer? And so this all gets reported at the conclusion of each traffic stop. Officers are given a unique ID code that is known only to them and to their chief that they use for reporting purposes. So there's not names, when these numbers get reported to the state, the SBI, it's all done through these unique ID codes. And that's another unique feature of North Carolina. We're one of only 2 states that sort of allows you to drill down to the individual officer level and take a look at the demographic characteristics of who individual officers are stopping. And so once a month, this data gets reported to someone on staff at the police department who's designated for reporting this data, and it gets relayed, it's now done electronically, to the State Bureau of Investigation. So they publish and have published for some time some of this data. This is the website, you can check it out at this URL up top. Some of this data is available online. There's no charts or graphs, there's no visuals, it's all just kind of grids of numbers and percentages. But you've always been able to access some basic information about who's being stopped in your community. The problem has been there's a lot of information that does not show up on this website. And if you're interested in learning about an individual officer, there's no way to do that. And there's no easy way to make comparisons between departments unless you just kind of do it manually or create your own spreadsheets. And so one of the things that I did when I started doing this work was worked with the Code for America Brigade in Durham to create a website which is now available at opendatapolicing.com. We've actually got 3 states up now. And you can go to this website now and you can access all the information that's not reported on the state site. One of the remarkable things that I learned when I started working with traffic stops in 2013 is that the police in North Carolina go through a lot of effort to compile this data, but most agencies don't really have any meaningful way of scrutinizing the data. I mean, it's all kind of just segmented and assembled in a way that is just not very useful to anyone. And so it all gets relayed to the state. And there's the state's database now, and our website now has more than 21 million stops in it. But if you were to request it through a public records request, which is how I did, and you try to open it on just a regular laptop, it would melt your computer down because it's like a 15 gigabyte text file basically is how you get it. And so our website kind of makes that data on a real-time basis. We update it once a month. Makes that data accessible. So it's always been available, but you just have never been able to really, unless you had kind of expensive software and political scientists available to you, there's just really no meaningful way to access it. And so that's kind of what we've attempted to do with this website. And so you can go onto this website, you can look up Asheville, you can look up Buncombe County, you can look up any jurisdiction in the state, kind of just see how they compare to other jurisdictions. So who makes use of this data? I'm going to talk about 3 different groups here today. The principal users of this traffic stop data in North Carolina in the last couple of years since it's been available have been community organizers, police executives, people who are in charge of managing police officers who are making traffic stops, and then defense and civil rights lawyers have found some applications for the data. So I'm going to talk a little bit about each one of those. So first, community organizers. I'm going to start in Durham because that's where I live, and this was kind of my first campaign working with this data. Durham PD kind of has this distinction of having some of the worst traffic stop data in the state. We have probably the most dramatic racial disparities. If you know Durham, you know that Durham is pretty much evenly split between black and white residents. We're white, 41% black, the rest Hispanic and Asian, and other races. And this graph right here is reflecting search data. And it's just kind of, I chose it because of just sort of, it's an interesting pyramid. What this displays, and if you go onto our website, you can actually toggle between different races. This shows the relative likelihood of a search occurring for a given stop cause as comparing black drivers to white drivers who are stopped for the same reason. So in Durham, the way to read this would be, so the bottom, the seatbelt. Historically, over the last decade and a half, if you were a black driver stopped in Durham for not wearing your seatbelt, you were 206% more likely to have your car searched than if you're a white driver who stopped for not wearing your seatbelt. Now that obviously is a rough metric, right? That's just looking at the universe of black drivers stopped for not wearing their seatbelt and the universe of white drivers stopped. And if you do multivariate analysis and can factor in gender and time of day and age, you will see some of those disparities shrink. But it's kind of an interesting observation that if you start up top driving while impaired, there's no disparity. And as discretion seems to get bigger, or as these offenses become more discretionary, you tend to see that discretion exercised in a way that is more racially burdensome on black drivers. And so the first thing the police said when we brought this to their attention in Durham was, well, this could be these other factors that explain it. And in Durham, we took the time to go and get some political scientists to do a multivariate regression analysis for it. So we did a couple things. First, we said, let's eliminate the top third of police officers in the Durham Police Department who generate the most racially disparate stops. Let's just take them out. So let's say we got rid of the top third most race disparity generating officers. And then let's hold people gender and age and time of stop. So what that effectively means is we're only going to look at 21-year-old black males stopped for not wearing their seatbelt and compare them to 21-year-old white males stopped for the same reason. We're only going to look at them if they were stopped around the same time of day, and then we're going to compare outcomes. So we kind of held all these things equal, and what we found was that even when we did that, and this is just for Durham, I'm not making any claims about Asheville here, because I've not done this analysis. But in Durham, for Hispanics, it was interesting, the disparities disappeared when you held all those things equal. But when you did it for black drivers, they did not. So a black motorist in Durham was still 165% more likely to be searched pursuant to a stop than a white motorist, even when you accounted for all those things. And even when the department, if you removed all the top third of the officers, you'd still have a 61% greater likelihood. And so the conclusion that we drew from this, and again, this is just Durham, was that in Durham at least, this was a systemic and an institutional problem that was not just a matter of a couple bad apple officers. It was really a function of how officers were being deployed, where they were being deployed. And so with this data in hand, organizers in Durham paired their personal stories with this empirical data and went to the city council and demanded a formal investigation. And so we did things like we made this movie, Stories of Racial Profiling in Durham, which you can watch online. And it's 10 different stories of drivers in Durham talking about their experiences being pulled out of their cars and searched. None of them was anything ever discovered. And then we had people go to the city council and kind of tell them their personal stories, and then we also had people present this empirical data. And eventually the mayor in Durham called for a formal investigation, and so the Human Relations Commission spent the better part of a year in 2013 and 14 investigating. We had 13 hearings over the course of 7 months, where the police department was given as much time as they wanted to sort of present their side of the story. We had a lot of community members participate, hundreds over the course of the months, tell their stories, present data. And at the end, the Human Relations Commission concluded that the department had been engaging in a pattern and practice of racial profiling. And they made a series of policy recommendations to address that. Durham PD disputed that finding at the time and said that this was all sort of a misunderstanding of the numbers and that they were going to do commission their own independent analysis. And so they did that, and that analysis was just published about 6 months ago. They did it through a firm called RTI International, which is a research firm in the Triangle. And RTI looked at Greensboro, Fayetteville, Charlotte, I'm sorry, not Charlotte, Winston-Salem, and Durham. So it looked at 4 cities at once. And they came back and they exonerated the other 3 cities, but they came back and concluded that Durham PD had a problem with explicit racial bias. They found that they were much more likely to stop black drivers during the daytime when they were easier to be seen than at nighttime. So Durham PD had to then hold a press conference and kind of concede that their own study had reached the same conclusion that the Human Relations Commission had. This campaign ended up getting some national publicity. It was on the front page of the New York Times in the fall of, I think, November of 2014. And this story just kind of goes into detail, if you're interested, about sort of how this data was used to sort of achieve these policy goals. And you can see our city councilman, Steve Schul, here saying without the data, nothing would have happened. So one of the things that came out of this whole process was the city agreed to require the police to obtain written consent to search vehicles in cases where they didn't have probable cause. One of the things that we learned throughout the series of hearings was that Durham police were relying very heavily on consent searches. So they would very frequently, like 60% of the time that they would do a search, they would assert that they had obtained the motorist's permission to conduct the search. And very often, those motorists would dispute that and say that, we didn't give our consent. Why would I give consent if I had something in my car? And there was just a lot of back and forth about whether or not people were actually consenting. There was really no way to confirm it. And eventually, the city said, well, if it's truly consensual, let's require that the police advise people of their right to refuse in situations where they do have that right. And let's get them to sign a piece of paper that advises them of rights and where they're granting the police rights. So there's no ambiguity. And so that was one of the policy changes that came about. So in the last 2 years, we've seen a 75% reduction in consent searches. So we've reduced consent searches. We've also reduced searches citywide, not dramatically, but 14%. One of the other policy changes that was implemented was there are now periodic mandatory audits of individual officer stop data and search data. So the police will now periodically, when they're doing sort of a performance review of an officer, when they sit down to kind of go over any complaints or commendations they might have received, they'll also take a look at their traffic stop data. And just now they have a policy of someone looks at that data at least a couple times a year, so that if there is something anomalous, there's an opportunity to intervene and have a discussion with that officer. And so that's now done. And then the police department as a whole now has a requirement where they have to present to the city council when they do their quarterly crime reports. They also do traffic stop race reports. So they'll break down, here's how many black drivers and white drivers we stopped this quarter, here's how many black drivers and white drivers we searched this quarter. So again, if there's anything anomalous at the aggregate department level, there's now an opportunity for the city council to have a dialogue about that. Greensboro also has made use of this data. Organizing Greensboro had brought similar concerns to their city council. This also led to a front page story in the New York Times the following year, so this was 2015. And this story was a little different. It wasn't as focused on searches, which was kind of the focus, at least insofar as the data was concerned in Durham. This was more about stops. Why are the police in Greensboro stopping people, and how do those stops break down along racial lines? And what they found was that most black Greensboro drivers who were stopped for regulatory or equipment violations. Those are the type of violations, as the Times says, that officers tend to have more discretion to ignore. Officers really don't have a lot of discretion. If they see someone driving erratically or dangerously all over the road, or they see a drunk driver, they have to make a stop. When it's things like, crooked license plates or a broken taillight, there is more discretion. And the concern in Greensboro was that discretion tended to be exercised in a way that was more burdensome on black drivers. We know overall, just generally speaking, that equipment violations, regulatory violations tend to correspond more with poverty. And poverty corresponds, as we know, in many places with race. And so regulations that sort of turn on poverty often tend to have a racially disparate impact. And so this Times article came out showing just sort of the racial disparities in traffic stops in Greensboro, and the very next day, within 24 hours, this headline appeared in the Greensboro paper, and the chief here in Greensboro made an announcement that he was issuing an order that officers stop making minor traffic stops in response to the racial disparity concerns. So ending or phasing out regulatory stops. And last year, Greensboro actually had their lowest number of traffic stops in the last decade and a half since the data has been reported. And during that same time, we've seen a 10% reduction in the racial stop disparities. So they started phasing out these regulatory low-level discretionary stops, and it has produced positive racial equity benefits. And you can kind of see the trend starting to go down. And this is a still from our website, the Open Data Policing website. Defense work. I'm not going to say a whole lot about this. I don't know if there's any lawyers in the rooms, but we've also seen this data used by defense lawyers in certain cases where there was specific reason to question why a traffic stop was made. So I'm just going to talk about one case. This was a case that I had worked on a couple years ago in Orange County, which is Chapel Hill. There was a 57-year-old Mexican national who was stopped for what was reported as a safe movement violation by an Orange County deputy. And this traffic stop, I should add, was captured on video. One of the first things that kind of tipped the defense lawyer who was assigned this case off that there might be something amiss was that she was watching the video and there was just no movement. I mean, the car was just going down the road, the officer pulled it over, but there was no, what the officer was reporting in his written description about the car swerving was just not on the video. So that was the first tip that something might be amiss. In any case, the officers who made this stop conducted a vehicle search. They reported that they got the driver's consent to search, but the driver didn't speak English and there was not on the video. And so that was the second tip that something might be amiss and that maybe the search was not legal. But at any rate, they ended up finding a lot of drugs in the car. In fact, it was the biggest drug seizure in that county that year. It was 3 pounds of methamphetamine, which is a lot of methamphetamine. And so the LC, the defendant here, was facing a 23.5-year mandatory minimum, which would have effectively been a life sentence in his case. What happened in this case was we used the traffic stop, the known traffic stop, put it into the website. We're able to identify the number, the officers who had stopped this driver. And what we saw was this. So this displays Hispanic versus non-Hispanic. So we categorize race and ethnicity differently in North Carolina. Some states collapse the two. So we have sort of this binary choice, Hispanic, non-Hispanic, and then black, white. So you'll have black Hispanics and black non-Hispanics. So you have to kind of toggle between the two. But so this is displaying the page for these officers for Hispanic, non-Hispanic, Hispanic being the green line. So what they showed was for 4 consecutive years, this deputy had searched as many or more Hispanics than he did non-Hispanics in a county that was just 8% Hispanic. And then when we dug a little further, we looked at the hit rate. This same deputy only found contraband historically on 1% of Hispanics that he searched, 17% of non-Hispanics. So what this means, and this was a deputy that was searching at a very high volume, or it was a pair of deputies, and they were assigned to this sort of task force. These deputies were searching so many people that when you actually remove them from the statewide data set of officers, 10,000 officers, it actually shifted the statewide Hispanic search rate by 0.1%. So it wasn't that we were just talking about a small number of stops. These were deputies that were stopping a high volume of individuals that were aggressively searching pretty much every Hispanic driver they searched for years on end. For 4 consecutive years, they were searching hundreds of Hispanics, never finding anything, or once out of 100 finding something, and they just happened to hit the jackpot with this gentleman. So this data was then presented to the district attorney. It didn't actually make it to the judge. The judge ordered that the ID number be produced, And once these numbers kind of came to light, the DA voluntarily offered the gentleman the time served, and he was deported, but he did not spend the rest of his life in prison. But more importantly, and I don't mean to present this to say like this is a technology that can help you get off and commit crime. I know that some people interpret it that way, but this really did lead to some serious discussions within the Orange County Sheriff's Department about, one, how is it that we have deputies that for years on end can be stopping and searching people at such a high rate, never finding anything, and no one ever notices? And two, these guys just cost us our biggest drug case of the year, so we don't like that. And it really, these officers really couldn't provide any sort of coherent explanation for these numbers, and so ultimately the task force that they were on was disbanded and they were reassigned, and we think that on balance that is good for the Orange County community, that they are not engaging in those sorts of practices. But this all came to light only in the context of a criminal case. Normally, there's 99 Hispanics who did not have anything in their car were not arrested. And so short of going and filing a complaint, there's really just no way for anyone to ever know. So it does tend to come to light more so in the context of these criminal cases where drugs or something else is found in the car. Yeah.
So if that lawyer had not never challenged it, it would have never come to the light.
Yeah, if the lawyer had not looked into it, that guy would probably be in prison for the rest of his life. I always say to lawyers, just take a minute to hop on the website, just eyeball the numbers, and you could save yourself a lot of time. This would have gone to trial. This would have been a lot of work would have gone into preparing for this trial. This case was disposed of in like 10 minutes once these numbers came to light. And in fact, these same deputies had arrested a number of Hispanic defendants in traffic stops that were made into federal cases. So the federal prosecutor at the time had 3 cases, and once he learned what had happened in the state case, he ended up dismissing all the cases that had been brought by these 2 deputies against Hispanic defendants. And so those 3 cases were dismissed as well. So that's one application of defense work. And then finally, improving police management. So as I said at the beginning, in North Carolina, there are a number of agencies that are already using this site as a management and supervisory tool. These 2 photos show Chief Harold Medlock, who just retired as the Fayetteville chief, but he was someone who was kind of recognized as sort of a forward-thinking police chief, who was really one of the first chiefs in the state of North Carolina to embrace data as a means of improving the quality of policing in his neighborhood. We've got an epidemiologist at UNC who we've hired as part of this sort of interesting partnership with Fayetteville PD, where they've granted us access to all of their 911 data, their traffic stop data, their pedestrian and vehicle fatality data, and we're mapping traffic stops and giving them feedback about locations in Fayetteville where officers seem over-deployed relative to the dangers, known dangers in terms of areas where there's a lot of fatalities or accidents, and places where they're underdeveloped. And so we're looking for opportunities to kind of shift where officers deployed in a way that will both improve public safety and improve racial equity and bring down those disparities. And over here on the right is former Attorney General Lynch. She came to Fayetteville just a couple months ago, and Chief Medlock demonstrated this website to her and talked about how his department was using this data to sort of conduct periodic audits of their officers. And this is all consistent with the recommendations of the former president's task force on 21st century policing. One of their main recommendations was, let's collect this data, let's make this data available online, and let's use this to spot problems before they happen. And so that everything that we've done with this Open Data Policing Initiative and this website has really been aimed at making real that recommendation to the President's task force. And we just launched this for the state of Maryland a month or 2 ago. So I don't think anyone here is interested in that, but so we just launched this, and immediately the Baltimore Sun put it on their front page and issued this editorial just kind of addressing this very issue, saying that departments need to be analyzing the data to spot discrepancies between the demographics of the communities individual officers are assigned to patrol and the race of the motorists they stop and search. Such an approach could serve as an early warning system for officers whose practices might be problematic and could enable departments to offer them individualized help in eliminating biases. So, this is, imagine if the Orange County Sheriff had been kind of periodically scrutinizing his data, he might have caught those two deputies who were engaged in those bad stop practices before they cost him his biggest case of the year.
Is that part of the way that, it's intended to be used, not just kind of coming up with department-wide or city-wide policy changes, but really to identify people that are, like in your words, bad apples?
Well, I mean, we intended to be used by all three of these different groups. I think that's the most useful application for police departments, yeah, is one, just keeping an eye on your overall departmental aggregate trends and seeing how those stack up against other jurisdictions of your size. But yeah, absolutely, we have a feature here that exists that really only police chiefs can use. So police chiefs have a list of the numbers that correspond to officers. No one else has that list. They can go onto our advanced search page that's built just for them, and they can type in that number, and they can hit enter, and it'll populate the career enforcement patterns for that officer since 2002. And they know what those officers' numbers should, more or less look like, and so they can very quickly scrutinize that data. So Asheville, what does the data show in Asheville? So this is the stop page in Asheville. So these are the percentage of traffic stops, white being green, blue representing black drivers. And as you see, black drivers in Asheville over the last decade and a half have averaged about 20% of the stopped population, which is high, or higher than you would expect given the population demographics here. It works out to about 50% greater stop rate than the city population would lead you to suspect. And then when you look at the search data, so since data began being collected in 2002, black drivers in Asheville have been more than 100% more likely to be searched than white drivers, although they've been less likely to be found with contraband. And I'll get to that in a second. African Americans make up about 13% of the city population, but 32% of the search population. This is going back over the last 15 years. So that number is concerning. But again, I would stress this number, you would see that disparities this great or significantly greater in other communities. However, if the data reporting under Chief Hooper is accurate, there has been a significant reduction in the citywide stop and search rate in Asheville under her administration, although racial disparities in stops and searches have persisted. Now you see they are shrinking, so this graph, this is kind of what you want to see. You want to see those lines coming closer to the black line, which represents the overall departmental average. And then if you look at the stop cause, you see that this just is that graph you saw at the beginning for Durham, but this is broken out for Asheville by stop cause. It's not quite the same pyramid, which is also good. But there is some reason for concern. I mean, you see that historically over the last decade and a half, a black driver stopped for a speed limit violation in Asheville has been 230% more likely than the white driver to be searched. And if you're interested, if you go on the actual website where it says total there's a drop-down menu, and you can select individual years. So this is just all the aggregate data for the last decade and a half, but you can get that information for any given individual year if you're interested in seeing what those numbers look like last year, the year before. Yes, ma'am?
And will we be able to have access to this presentation? Or?
Yeah, and this is all online. So open,
But what you've done.
but the slideshow, absolutely, I can send it, I'll send it to
Okay.
you. Yeah.
Thank you.
And then the contraband hit rate. So as I mentioned, Asheville PD has actually found contraband on white drivers at a slightly higher rate than black drivers. 30% for white drivers over the last 15 years, 28% for black drivers. There's really no evidence that one racial group carries contraband higher than another. If you look at the entire data set, so the entire state of North Carolina, all police officers, 15 years, 22 million stops, the hit rate, and I know this only for consent searches off the top of my head, the hit rate for consent searches for black drivers and white drivers, you have to go to the third decimal point to find the difference. It's about 18% or thereabouts. But like, it's almost eerie how like identical the hit rate is for the state. If you're just looking at consent, yes, sir.
In that previous slide, the chart, I saw that it read Native American, Asian, and then other. Why is it broken up like that?
That is how the state collects the data. So they categorize people as black, white, Native American, Asian, or other. And then they have a separate box for Hispanic or non-Hispanic. So we work with the categories that they give us. So if you go onto the site and you click, you fill in that little bubble, it'll just create more bar charts, so then it'll give you the relative likelihood of a search. If you're a Native American versus white, or if you're Native American versus black, you can kind of just get intraracial comparisons. So it's worth noting that these figures may, and this is the case for every community again, they may undercount the actual disparities because we've done multiple audits of the database and just statewide audits, not Asheville specific audits. And what we know is that in many instances, the data is incomplete. There's stops that aren't reported, there's searches that aren't reported, and the stops and searches that tend to be more likely to not be reported tend to be the ones where people might find them a little more problematic, the ones that you might not want to report. So that's an ongoing issue, is data integrity. We have a very robust data set. It's probably the largest data set of its kind anywhere in the world. But it relies upon individual officers to report their data and always report their data. And we know just from experience that doesn't always happen. So this website, now that it's online, now that it's updated regularly, I guess a second application for police would be they can use it to spot check whether or not their officers are actually reporting their stops. And one way you can spot check is you can go down to the clerk's office, you can just pull random shucks from the clerk's office and see, okay, well, here's the traffic stop for this date. I see that this was, a white female who's 21 years old, and then you can type that information into our website and see whether or not that stop was reported under the statute as required by law. And then finally, or I should say, so we know there's this ongoing issue of consent searches that I mentioned. There's a lot of dispute about people whether or not they give consent or not. And we know from experience that a lot of searches are reported as consent searches that when you really scrutinize them, they look at the video or whatever, they're not. And then finally, we know from car registration, vehicle ownership data in North Carolina, that slightly over half of black households own a car, and that number is closer to 85% for white households. So black drivers are actually underrepresented in the driving population, are more likely to rely on public transit. So when you factor that in, these disparities are actually, in many communities, greater than the numbers would reflect. Now, you also have to factor in commuter cities. Are there people driving through town without stopping because they are part of the driving population, and they may be disproportionately more black. There's a lot of different factors that you have to consider, but we do know from the driving or the car ownership data that black drivers are underrepresented.
Is there reporting for pedestrian stops?
No, so pedestrian stops are not part of this database. This is only vehicle stops. So I think the last number I saw was 51% of police citizen interactions each year, I think this is in America, are traffic stops. So you're capturing the very slight majority of police citizen interactions. Maybe higher in North Carolina. I think we're maybe more of a driving state than some other states. So how does Asheville compare to other communities of its size in North Carolina? So as I said, Asheville does have persistent racial stop disparities and persistent search disparities. But to give Asheville credit, they are somewhat less pronounced disparities than those in the other 6 cities of comparable size. So I looked at kind of Asheville's population plus or minus 20,000 people. So you're talking about Concord, Gastonia, Greenville, I guess I have Gastonia twice, High Point, and Wilmington. I'm trying to think who I left out. But anyway, those 6 cities if you look at the black overrepresentation in the stop population and the search population, those numbers are more problematic and more dramatic in those other cities. So that is an encouraging, I mean, that of the, on this list of disparities, you are the least disparate of the 6 similarly sized cities in North Carolina. So I think that number is encouraging, but still, there's definitely room for improvement. If you look at the last 5 years, the data again kind of is consistent with the last 15 years of data, which is about a 50% higher rate than representation in the driving populations. The last 5 years, 18% of traffic stops were black drivers compared to 13% of the population. So I was here a couple weeks ago and met with Chief Hooper and presented this data to her. And one of the things that, and I shared that same observation that the disparities were lower than the other cities. But I did express surprise, I guess, at the stop rate. So the stop rate in Asheville appears to be, over the last couple of years, significantly lower than these other cities, which raised the question of, are we capturing all of the traffic stops? Is Asheville reporting all of their data? In 2015, they only reported 7,400 traffic stops. You compare that to Concord's 21,000, and Asheville and Concord have the same population. Jacksonville, which has 21,000 less people, reported more than twice as many traffic stops. So when you kind of compare the stop numbers across jurisdictions, it does raise the question of whether or not all the data is being properly reported.
What about in previous years, Asheville? What were those?
So in previous years, the numbers were a lot higher. They were much more in line with what you would see in Concord and Jacksonville and these other similarly sized cities, which is, I was not aware of any significant, and I think I had asked, had there been any significant policy changes that would explain that? And you look at the search data, it's even more dramatic. According to the data, there's been an 83% drop in the last 5 years in the number of searches citywide. And I expressed some real skepticism about that number. Chief Hooper suggested that this could be a result of a problem related to problematic radar detectors. So there was this issue in Asheville in 2014, and I was just speaking right before this meeting with some members of the department. It apparently was not resolved, at least into 2015, which may explain these numbers. So Asheville came out, I guess, that there were about 3 dozen radar detectors that were in use that were not calibrated properly, and that led to some charges being dismissed. And then that apparently led to, for a time, a lot of detectors being taken offline. And if officers don't have radar detectors, you would expect that they would make less stops. So I can't speak to whether or not that explains these numbers or not. The department is currently looking into that and is going to be, I think, sharing some information with this committee in the future about whether they do explain that, or maybe it's a combination of some officers not reporting and also the radars being offline. I don't know. I can't speak to that, and that's for folks here to determine, I guess. But there is a significant drop in the number of reported stops and searches over the last 2 years. One thing that is pretty consistent in the data, though, is this consent searches, and this is something I do think is somewhat concerning. Asheville PD appears to rely pretty heavily on drivers' consent for purposes of conducting searches, and these searches disproportionately impact black drivers, who account for 40% of drivers searched annually. 56%, so over half of reported searches over the last 5 years have been reported as consent searches. That's a really high number. So I had a chief tell me one time that any time that your percentage of consent searches out of the overall search population ticks up over 35–40%, I'm concerned, because that tells me that I have a lot of officers engaging in suspicion searches and phishing expeditions is the term they use. And so they kind of set their own sort of internal benchmark at 35%. If you look at other departments around the state now, Fayetteville and Durham both have mandatory written consent. So in Durham, that number is 13% of overall searches are consent searches compared to Asheville's 56%. In Fayetteville, 3%. Fayetteville has a much more pronounced crime problem, a much more pronounced need to conduct searches than Asheville. And they're getting by with only 3% of their consent searches, or of their searches being consent searches. And Concord, that number was 21%. Concord is pretty aggressive in their traffic stops.
So the black population of Fayetteville is like 40%, and the black population of Asheville is like maybe 12 or 10%?
Yeah, I'm not talking about race here, I'm just talking about, I am talking about race in terms of, the racial breakdown of searches, but when I'm talking about consent searches, I'm just talking about what percentage of all of the searches that occur are premised upon a motorist purportedly granting consent.
Sure, I'm just asking more generally about the comparisons between the cities. If you're a bad apple in Fayetteville and you're trying to find black motorists to stop, it seems like you would just be like 4 times more likely to have a black motorist pass you by because the population, black people represent 4 times more of the population of Fayetteville than they do here. Is there any attempt to try to kind of like ferret that out or balance that out and say how these compare across cities with similar racial makeups?
Well, so a couple things. I'm not really trying to make a comment about race when I'm pointing out the percentage of searches that are consent searches. I think that these are kind of 2 different issues. One is, what is the sort of ideal number, or what number would we expect to be the number of searches that occur with black motorists? And I would hope that number would more or less reflect the population. And then there's a separate question of all the searches that happen, what is an appropriate percentage of those searches to be premised on consent? Because if you're searching because you got the person's consent to search, typically, not always, but typically that indicates that you don't have probable cause, that the person hasn't done anything that gives the officer the legal right to search, and so the officer is just relying upon that person's permission to get in their vehicle or in their purse or in their trunk. And in my experience, most police chiefs that I've talked to about this sort of in detail don't want the majority of their searches to be premised on people giving them consent. Mainly because they don't want to be searching people who don't have anything on them, they're not going to find anything. Consent searches are rarely productive. 85 or whatever, 80% of the time they don't turn up anything. And so I'm just flagging this as something that did sort of stand out to me when Dee had asked me to sort of do an overview of the data. The fact that such a high percentage of searches in Asheville historically have been premised on a purported grant of consent is potentially a problem and might be addressed by implementing a written consent policy such as exists in Fayetteville and Durham. There's also social science research about sort of the racial dynamics in play in the context of consent searches, that blacks and whites are socialized differently by their parents, by society, in terms of how they are expected to act when stopped by the police, how they are expected to act when asked for permission to search, that there is a great deal more social pressure on people of color to accede to an officer's request to prove their innocence than there is to a white motorist who might feel more comfortable asserting their right to say no. And so people who have sort of studied this issue have suggested that written consent is a way of sort of equalizing or normalizing that experience between black and white drivers, so that the onus is not on the black driver to assert their rights. It's the police officer who's saying, you have rights and I will respect your rights if you should choose not to grant consent. Yes, ma'am.
Is there any way this data can be broken down by neighborhood to see if there's certain neighborhoods that are being targeted intentionally for the purpose of profiling?
So in Asheville, I don't think that is possible currently. In Fayetteville, that is possible because Fayetteville and a couple other places in North Carolina have voluntarily started collecting geolocational information about their traffic stops. The statute that we get our information from does not currently mandate that departments record the location of traffic stops. I think that the statute is likely to be tweaked in the next year or two. I mean, I think there's a consensus starting to emerge from all different quarters, all different groups that work with this data, including law enforcement, have an interest in having that data. Law enforcement often takes the position that if we had this locational data, it would put things in context and would help sort of exonerate them from some of these claims that some people are making about the data. And people like me who study this, I mean, we want to have all the information we can have so that we can have the best understanding of what's happening that we can. So I think everyone agrees that it'd be good to have that information. It's not required to be collected. There are some departments that are collecting that information. That's certainly something that this community could ask the department here to start collecting. And if they did collect that data after a year or two, we would have that ability to do that sort of analysis. And then, so my last observation I think about Asheville had to do with regulatory and equipment-based stops. I talked a little bit about these in the context of Greensboro and just how these are real drivers of the racial disparities that we see in a lot of communities. And this is true in Asheville. So since the beginning of 2011, so just looking at the last 5 years in Asheville, 40% of all black motorists stopped by the Asheville Police Department were stopped for an equipment or regulatory violation, as compared with 32% of white motorists stopped. So you can imagine year after year, this 8% disparity, like that disparity just keeps getting bigger. And so one way to mitigate that disparity would be, again, to follow the suit of Greensboro and Fayetteville and these other departments that have started to recognize that these regulatory stops, these equipment-based stops, often cause more problems than they solve for the community. So this brings us to policy suggestions. So starting with regulatory stops, you could, as some departments have done, prohibit or formally deprioritize regulatory and equipment-based traffic stops that are known to drive these racial disparities. You could make a value judgment as a city council, as a city, that we think that it's more important that we have racial equity in our traffic stops and our traffic searches than it is that we, correct people when they have crooked license plate. Or we think there's a better way to do it. There are some states that instead of stopping someone who has the broken taillight, simply the officer makes note of the license plate and they send them a letter because they know where they live because they've got their DMV data, and they say, hey, you were observed on the road. We didn't want to stop you and bother you, but your car is out of compliance. Please get this fixed. If you think about the shooting in Minnesota last year, the one that everyone saw broadcast on Facebook, that gentleman had been stopped, close to 50 times in the 5 or 10 years prior to that incident. And when you look at why he was being stopped, his car was constantly it was not up to code. His family, says that he did, what he could to keep his car in code, but these court fees, they pile up, and it can just be very onerous to get out from under that. And that experience and just, he was shot and killed in the course of a stop that probably didn't really even need to happen. And so a number of police chiefs in the wake of that shooting went public with their reservations about these stops. I can't remember the name of the chief in Connecticut. There was a chief in Connecticut who was all over the press the month after that shooting saying, I've come to the conclusion that these stops are the stops that are most likely to lead to those sorts of situations. And it's because people don't often understand why they're being stopped. They're stopped for a real sort of what they would consider a ticky-tacky sort of reason. My license plate's crooked, or one of my many taillights might be burned out. But you might not know that. And some officers don't feel, inclined to explain themselves to people. So people say, why did you stop me? And the officers will sometimes say, not all of them, but some of them will say, I asked the questions, and then that quickly, then the person who stopped feels like, well, why can't I get an explanation for why I'm being detained? And it just kind of devolves from there. And speaking personally, like I sometimes represent people who are charged with resist, delay, and obstruct, which is a charge that sometimes people get as like a standalone charge where there's nothing else charged. And when you really scrutinize these stops, you'll often find that, or you watch the videos of them, and it'll be just that. The person stopped, they don't understand why they're stopped, they ask the officer for an explanation, the officer takes offense that they're asking them questions, kind of maybe isn't very courteous to the person, and then the person says something that offends the officer, and then before you know it, the officer's pulling their taser and ordering people out of the car, and you're just sitting here like, what are we doing, right? And most of the time, that happens in the context of these low-level regulatory stops. If someone's speeding, they generally know that they've been speeding. If they're driving drunk, they generally know. They don't always know that they're doing anything wrong when they're stopped for these reasons. Yes, ma'am?
I just want to clarify one thing on this. These other cities that have chosen to do this, does that include seatbelt violations?
No.
Okay, so
No,
that's a separate category
that's a
around
separate
safety.
category. Yes,
Thank
ma'am.
you.
And so, yeah, so Fayetteville and Greensboro have deprioritized these types of stops, and that has both shrinked racial stop disparities and also brought down the traffic stops overall. And Chapel Hill, just 2 months ago, the town council, working in partnership with the chief, resolved to phase out these types of stops for the same racial equity reasons. Another policy suggestion would be to mandate written consent to search for all consent-based searches. This would probably overnight take care of the issue of having such a high percentage of consent searches, because not everyone's gonna consent, right? So you're gonna have less consent searches. It will mean that searches don't occur that otherwise might have occurred, and that's the trade-off. And so there probably will be some drugs that go undetected that otherwise might have been found, but you weigh that against, these racial imbalances, and it's a value judgment. What do we prioritize more? Yes, sir.
In a case of non-consent and just a suspicion on the part of the police officer, but can he hold the vehicle and the individual until there's a dog out there?
No, the Supreme Court has ruled that once the initial purpose for making a traffic stop has come to a conclusion, the police may not detain someone beyond that purpose for purposes of getting the dog out and establishing probable cause. If there happens to be a dog in the officer's car, he's at liberty to walk it around the car, and if the dog signals, they can do it. But they can't detain you for purposes of getting the dog to the scene. So one policy suggestion for Asheville would be you could follow the policies implemented by Chapel Hill, Durham, and Fayetteville, and a couple other jurisdictions, and require officers to obtain written authorization from the party to be searched for all consent-based searches. We have this in effect in Durham, not just for vehicle stops, but for all searches. So we had a problem in Durham where officers were, this came out on the stand, an officer testified to this in open court, that he was trained to, whenever he could not get probable cause to search someone's home, and wanted to conduct a search, they would go knock on the person's door and say, we received a 911 call from this residence saying that someone was in danger inside. We need to come in and look and make sure that everyone's safe. And then they would enter the home under the pretext of checking on the safety of people inside, and they would arrest them. And they arrested this particular woman who they did this to for marijuana. The defense attorney elicited this testimony at trial, and then it turned out that these officers were being trained to do this. This is, of course, very illegal, and so they've been retrained, and this policy has been put in effect for home searches as well. And again, this is, I'm not making any claims about Asheville. Durham has kind of got its own unique problems, but it's that sort of policy can pay dividends in other arenas beyond just traffic stops. Yes, sir.
Mr. Mance, point of clarity, since you have so many agencies and different groups representing the community in this room, would you add a point of clarity in mentioning for educational purposes to these people that the Supreme Court, not too many months ago, have ruled now that if you have any kind of traffic ticket or citation, that it automatically gives the officer a right to search, and furthermore, although it was against Fourth Amendment, now it is legally, you are held legally liable if the search finds any illegalities of any nature in your vehicle.
Well, so I am not aware of any case that allows officers to search. To my knowledge, that's not correct. I think that what you might be thinking of is certain probationers, people who are under supervision, sometimes as a sort of one of the things that they agree agree to, you know, so that they can be released, is that they will make themselves available to searches if they're stopped by a police officer out in the community, and the officers can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm not aware of any, there's no law to, or case to my knowledge that grants police the right to search you just because you have some outstanding traffic.
No, I think as far as that probation, I believe there is a clause there that a probation officer has the ability to do a warrantless search.
Right.
During a home visit or whatever, but law enforcement can't
Yeah.
cross over
Right.
into the probationary world.
Yeah, I should have been.
Just
more
like
clear.
that.
Yeah, absolutely, right, and he's right, the probation officer, not just any officer.
I'm surprised that I'm one of the few people, I think I've showed this to you, laminated these at one time before, I don't have that particular briefcase with me, but I'll get in touch with the D and I'll give it to them, and they'll put it
Yeah, I mean,
on.
I'd be interested to read the case you're thinking of. I mean, Supreme Court cases, you know, often take, are often very contextual, like specific to a certain context. So there might be some unique context in which, you know, the court has recognized this or that exception to the Fourth Amendment, but there is no blanket rule. I mean, I can say pretty emphatically, if you have an outstanding traffic ticket, or you haven't paid one, that does not give police license to search you. If they stop you, they still have to have probable cause or obtain your consent. But I'd be happy to review any opinion.
Yeah, I won't, you know, unless it's a misprint, and I won't dispute it since you deal with law every day. But I noted it in there, and even, Justice Sumner made, she had a comment about it, but it was supposed to have been a Supreme Court ruling.
So you might be thinking, there was a case that Justice Sotomayor wrote a pretty, wrote a kind of very emphatic dissent of, that did come from North Carolina. I think it was, I feel like the case was called Hine or something. And it was about a reasonable mistake of law. If a police officer makes a stop for a purpose that turns out to not be a criminal violation, but they were reasonably mistaken in making that stop, that anything found in the course of a lawfully conducted search pursuant to that stop could be used. And I know Justice Sotomayor had strong feelings about that and dissented from that. And that was a case where the person had been stopped for having a burnout taillight in North Carolina. North Carolina has a unique taillight statute that I think allows you, or it might have been changed by now, but that allows you to basically have a burnout taillight as long as you had some functioning taillights. And the officer didn't know that, so made a stop and then arrested someone pursuant to that stop, and they challenged that. And the court said that it was a reasonable mistake of law, and a lot of defense lawyers and civil rights folks didn't like that because they felt like police should be expected to know what the law is at all times, and you know, people generally can't avail themselves of that defense. So written consent would be another policy that you might consider. And again, I alluded to this study. There's an article that I referred Chief Hooper to by Professor Devin Carbato, who's at UCLA Law, and it's published in the Michigan Law Review. It's called Erasing the Fourth Amendment, and it kind of gets into the weeds about the racial dynamics at play in consent searches. If you're interested in reading more about that, yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I just had a question about, so you were talking about how, you know, the argument that implementing something like that could greatly reduce the amount of stops that he, you know, drugs and searches or whatever the case might be. I was just wondering if there were any legal or significant organized pushbacks to implementing those policies in those three places that you know of.
Well, I mean, in Fayetteville, the department was on board and the chief did it kind of on his own initiative. In Durham, there was a lot of pushback. The police chief, the ex-police chief, the police chief at the time felt that, yeah, but he felt very strongly that, you know, the city council, the city community groups shouldn't be telling the department, you know, how to conduct searches and how they should get permission. And I think that the Fraternal Order of Police and the North Carolina Sheriff's Association kind of took a similar tack. So there has been some pushback, You know, the thing about written consent, and I think the way that we overcame that hurdle in Durham was we went back to the data. We said, well, what would your drug and what would your gun seizure data look like if you didn't have consent searches? Because the big thing in Durham, we're the most violent city in the state. The big thing is how do we bring these shootings down? You know, we had a record number of murders last year, and is this gonna impact our ability to be effective in stopping violent crime? And what we found is that it's really not. That people who are doing the shootings in Durham are not, by and large, don't have cars, for one thing. So they're not driving around with guns in their cars. If you just take out the consent search data and just look at that and say, well, how many guns do we find pursuant to consent searches? It was single digits over the previous years. So it's a very, very small number of guns. It's by and large small quantities of marijuana that when they do find something, which they rarely find anything, but when they do, it tends to be small quantities of marijuana. Consent searches just aren't an efficient way of finding weapons. And so we pointed that out to the city because the police department took the position, you're gonna tie our hands and it's gonna be hard for us to, find weapons, which is what you tell us to do. And so we used the data to show that actually you would have still found the same amount of weapons. Fayetteville, we also looked at this in Fayetteville. We found that Fayetteville actually, in the 2 years after implementing written consent compared to the 2 years prior, took more guns out of cars. It really had, and I don't know exactly why, but it seemed to have focused the officer's attention a little more on going after drivers who there was actually reason to believe had guns. Instead of casting so wide a net, they were more deliberate about who they were searching. And so even though they had less leeway to search, they were smarter about how they went about searching, and they actually took more guns out of cars after written consent than they did previous to written consent.
Do you think, I'm sorry.
Yes, ma'am.
Do you think, I used to live in Durham, and
Mhm.
like, McDougal Terrace is by far one of the largest housing projects I've seen personally in my life. And I know that the atmosphere in that housing project before it had very bad community police relations. That's one thing that we're trying to build here in Asheville, is community and police relations. Do you think that once these policies were changed, the community and police relationship in those communities improved?
Well, so it's interesting you mentioned McDougal Terrace because
That shooting that just happened over there?
yeah, so our office is representing the family of the guy that just was shot in McDougal Terrace a couple weeks ago. And I don't think there's any policy that can be implemented that's going to, change police-community relations there overnight. That's going to take a long, sustained effort. And I actually have experience with the officer. The officer who did that shooting, I had an excessive force complaint against last year that was sustained. Nothing was done. I don't know. I don't purport. I don't want to suggest that these problems or these policy proposals would substitute for the relationship building that needs to happen and to change those relationships and improve community relations. What I can say is that, and in Durham, we still have a lot of issues. So we're still sort of in the middle of this whole dialogue. I think Fayetteville is a better example of a shift in police-community relations. If you go back and read just the headlines in the newspaper in Fayetteville, if you Google Fayetteville NAACP, Fayetteville Police, 2011, 2012, you're going to see the Fayetteville NAACP saying a lot of very, very critical things about the Fayetteville Police Department. You're going to see a lot of protests and lots of people show up to city council meetings, and I think that it's fair to say that where they were in terms of police-community relations 5 years ago was a very bad place. Whereas today, and I had the opportunity to see this myself when Attorney General Lynch came to town, the NAACP, all the ministers there that were very critical of the police department in 2011 have now been brought into the fold, have been become part of sort of various advisory councils to the chief, and they all, they all spoke directly to the Attorney General during her visit about just how huge the shift has been in the last 5 years, and how much more they trusted their police department now than then. And if you just look at what happened in the intervening years, Chief Medlock, for one, he implemented all these policies. Two, he made a point of bringing the NAACP and other community groups into the fold so that they were there every time a big decision got made that impacted the community. They were part of that decision. And then the third thing he did was he became just completely transparent. There's no data set that exists within Fayetteville PD that they're not willing to share with me if I ask for it. And there's not many communities or departments that I can say that about. So I think that those three things were key in kind of turning things around in Fayetteville. And Fayetteville has had some high-profile police shootings of people of color in the last year or two. And I think had those shootings occurred in 2011-12, you would have seen a much different reaction. The response has been more measured. There's been more willingness in Fayetteville for the community to give the police the benefit of the doubt when those incidents happen. And because the police department has been really deliberate about engaging in dialogue and showing up for events like this each and every time they're held. So I think just kind of getting back to your question, the policies that I'm talking about are not going to do that, but they are part of sort of a larger approach that can effectively sort of shift those relationships. Which kind of brings me to the last policy suggestion. I only have 3 up here because Dee had also asked me to kind of think about things that would be no-cost policy. So all the things that I'm proposing here are just things that the department could do now that wouldn't cost any money to do. And so the last one would be make it a formal policy. Have a general order that says we're going to routinely audit the individual officer stop and search data. So just as I described earlier, going onto the website, just kind of eyeballing it. Make sure that you do that every 3 or 6 months, so that if you do have one of these Orange County type deputies on your force, you find out about it before they go on to lose you a big case or get you involved in a situation in the community that's bad for everyone. And so we really, when we designed this site, we made this feature, which the second URL is specifically for the police chiefs who are interested in doing just that. They can do it right now, it doesn't cost anything. And we think that if they do it, as the Baltimore Sun editorial said, it can serve as that sort of early warning system.
Is that open data site? Oh, it's not open to the public.
It is.
Oh, it is?
Yes, sir. Anyone can get on there.
Okay.
It's opendatapolicing.com.
Okay.
So that's it for my slideshow. I've been kind of taking questions as we went, but I'm happy to field any additional questions. Yes, ma'am.
Just to quickly review your 3 free or no-cost things, written consent policy, routine audit the officers, data every 3 to 6 months on stop and search. What was the second one?
The regulatory stops, banning or phasing out low-level regulatory and equipment-based violations. Yes, sir, there was another question.
Yeah, qualified immunity, can you speak on what that means? I heard the term and
So qualified immunity is a legal doctrine that the courts have recognized that shield police officers from personal liability for acts that they commit in the context of their job that a reasonable officer might have engaged in. So police can be sued for violating the Constitution, for violating someone's Fourth Amendment rights, but only if they acted in a way that a reasonable officer would not have acted, and if they were on notice that the conduct that they engaged in was against the law. So for example, the shooting down in South Carolina, where the video showed the officer shooting the man in the back as he ran away, that officer would not get qualified immunity. In fact, he's been criminally prosecuted, but they would be able to sue that officer because there's a Supreme Court case that says you may not shoot a fleeing suspect. So that is something that all police officers across the nation are on notice, that you can't shoot a fleeing unarmed suspect. And so officers cannot avail themselves of qualified immunity if they've done something that they've been warned they cannot do. But it does protect what is called reasonable mistakes, and that's generally a reasonable mistake. You know, what it boils down to is, does the court believe that what the officer did, another reasonable officer might have done in a similar situation?
So, to add to the question, standard police procedure. All reasonable officers should follow standard police procedures to preserve life at all costs. So when officers do not, when they just throw police procedure out the window, does that not take them away from the protection of qualified immunity?
Well, so the Supreme Court has recognized that there are times where an officer can violate procedure without violating the Constitution. So the Asheville Police Department might say, we don't allow our officers to do X behavior in the field, but the Supreme Court might not have held that whatever X is prohibited by the Constitution. So there are these kind of gray areas where you can violate a department protocol without violating the Constitution for qualified immunity purposes. But generally speaking, you're right. Generally speaking, if an officer violates a department procedure, that procedure was put in place because at some point along the way, the Supreme Court said, can't do this, whatever this thing is. And so they kind of implement that. So you have police attorneys that are constantly reviewing opinions from the federal courts about what is and isn't acceptable, and they will often tweak department training policies based on those opinions, so that if their officers, don't do anything that causes them to lose qualified immunity, basically. Yes, sir.
In the New York Times article on Greensboro, some professor was quoted saying, if there's a 40% disparity, you know, at least it's reasonable to be suspicious. You indicated one of the police chiefs in one of the cities knew a 35% figure that it was kind of cut off. Does the Southern Coalition have a rule of thumb number that would suggest?
Well, I think those are two different numbers we're talking about. I'd have to go back and look at the article because I'm imagining he's referring to percentage over-representation.
Yeah.
And when I was talking about the 35 or 40% threshold, I was referring specifically to what percent of all searches are consent-based. And you just don't want the majority, generally speaking, most departments don't want the majority of their searches being premised on something other than probable cause or exigency. They don't want it to be because they're convincing the majority of people they search to let them search. Because those searches generally aren't efficient, and you don't want to do things that aren't efficient. And so those are kind of two separate numbers. But as far as benchmarks, I've always I'm trying to think which department chief told me that. I can't recall at the moment, but that's just something I've always kind of kept in the back of my mind when I'm looking at consent search rates around the state, which there's a lot of variance. I tend to notice if the majority of the searches are consent-based searches. Because I haven't encountered any chiefs that have said, I want the majority of my searches to be consent-based searches. Yes, ma'am.
I wanted to connect two things and help me clarify, because you said two things at different points, and I think they're connected, but they may not be. So you said there was a significant reduction in citywide stop and search rate in the last couple of years here in Asheville.
Yes, ma'am.
And then later on, you said that there had been a significant drop in the number of searches citywide, which you were skeptical of. Are those things connected?
Well, so search rate is just what percentage of overall drivers that are stopped are searched. The average police officer in North Carolina searches about 3.2 out of every 100 people they stop. I think that's the last I looked. That was the average officer search rate. And then I think I was also talking about raw numbers. So you can say both about Asheville. You can say that the number of searches has declined significantly. You can also say that the search rate overall has declined. And I don't have them, I can see if I can,
Did you say 83%?
find that slide and we can look at what the rate was. So this is the, so if you go to the actual website, this is just a slide, but if you go to the actual website and hover your cursor over these lines, it'll give you the actual raw numbers and the percent, or the raw numbers, you can click the data tab to see the raw numbers. You hover over it, it'll give you the percentages. So 2016, you're looking like you're on, you know, where the average search rate is. So that's looking about overall, the overall number is about exactly where you would want it to be if you're using the statewide search rate as sort of your baseline. So the average police officer in North Carolina searches 3.2% of people. That's about where Asheville was in 2016. But if you go back to 2000, you go back 10 years, Asheville was searching 12 out of every 100 people, which is 4 times the statewide search rate. And so if I was here 10 years ago, I would have said, what is going on? Like, why are you searching people at 4 times the rate of you know, the average officer? But as I said, I mean, that number has steadily ticked down. But at the same time, if you're looking at it by race, you see that black drivers, really since data was collected, have been significantly more likely to be searched. So looks like last year, the number for black drivers was close to 6%, so that would be twice the statewide average search rate. And so that would be, you know, something that you might want to address. And you see that white drivers are a little underrepresented relative to the statewide search rate. I don't know if that, is that?
So connect to me, this 83% drop in the number of searches in the last 5 years with that.
So 83% drop in the raw numbers is just if you have 1,000 searches in 1 year and then you have, you know, roughly 180 searches the next year. That would
Does
be.
the one affect the other, I guess is what I'm saying, because you said we had this huge drop.
Yeah, one does affect the other.
Seems like there was a lot of underreporting.
Well, I don't know that. I mean, that's
Maybe.
something for, you
Radar
know,
detectors
folks
or-
to address. I can't speak to that. I presented this,
But
a
how
few
does
weeks ago.
how does that impact this slide, I guess is what I'm curious about.
Well, so
Another-
the denominator is the population of Asheville, right? And that hasn't shifted super dramatically over that period. So a drop in the raw numbers would necessarily affect this rate. So they are connected. The question is, are we in 2016, 2017, which I don't have the 2017 data on here, are we capturing the whole universe of stops or the whole universe of searches in Asheville? And I can't speak to that. You know, I had expressed some skepticism about it when I was here earlier this month meeting with the chief, but she informed me about this radar issue, which could explain it.
So if we put the radar, say if we put those searches in there, would that rate go up?
Well, I'm saying,
That's what I'm curious about.
it could be that this accurately reflects all searches in Asheville. It could be that it doesn't, and I don't know what the answer is.
That's what
I know
I'm
that
trying to understand.
the search numbers are gonna go down if you're making less stops. So if you made 20,000 stops 1 year and you made 10,000 the next, you can expect that the search numbers are gonna decline dramatically. Unless officers became much more aggressive in searching the less number of people that they stopped. I think it could, the radar issue, if basically the department decided in, you know, 2015, we're basically not going to make traffic stops in anywhere near the numbers we have before, that could conceivably explain this. And I'm not making any judgment about whether it does or not, because I'm gonna wait and see what the department presents.
I can present a little historical background on a difference in police policy in Asheville, being a native. This south side of Asheville is now much more gentrified. In other words, we have many more white residents. And the River Arts District is predominantly white. And we have, now this is a beer capital. So, but I know that 10 years ago, when this was predominantly black and this development was not here, we had roadblocks at least twice a month down here, at least. I mean, anybody who lived in this area can attest to that, and there has not been one roadblock in this area in 10 years. Not one. The other thing is, like I said, it is now the beer capital, so Asheville's revenue comes from tourists who come to drink beer. So if you harass people who come to spend money drinking beer, they're not coming to drink beer. You know what I'm saying? So you gotta let these people ride, and that's what happened.
How many more questions do we have besides Dolores? Excuse me. Does anybody else have another question?
I have one
Okay,
clarity.
so can we need to make some announcements about the CPAC meeting. And we're gonna just let you go ahead and ask your questions to them. We're allowed to go over. I told them we might face 2:30 because it is important, but we will make those announcements. So those of you who have questions, Ian, if you'll go ahead and answer those, and we'll make our announcements. Thank you.
My question is, with those stops and searches, how many of those led to resisting of arrest? Because we do know that because of North Carolina General Statute, I think it's 15A-410, that resist can lead to death. How many of those searches led to a resisting charge that can lead to death, or is that information available?
So that information is not available. There's no way to, this database or this law that I put up on the first slide does not require that officers report sort of after arrest what happened, or even what the charges were if there was an arrest. So there's just no way to know. I can only speak anecdotally that as someone who's defended people on resisting charges. North Carolina has a sort of a unique resisting charge. It's called resist, delay, and obstruct. Most people are familiar with resisting arrest, which they sort of naturally assume to mean that there has to be some underlying offense before you can be arrested for it. You have to be in the process of being arrested to resist. That's not the case. I mean, North Carolina, it's called resist, delay, or obstruct an officer in their official duties, which is a very vague statute. The Supreme Court has said it's constitutional, but a lot of people have doubts that the U.S. Supreme Court would take that view if they ever voted. What it means basically is that if you slow an officer down when they're trying to get answers, you're just kind of being evasive, or you're just kind of, in their subjective judgment, you have delayed them in their official duties or been kind of, obstructionist. They could conceivably charge you for something that falls short of any sort of physical resistance. So you don't have to physically resist them to catch that charge, and you don't have to be under arrest or being arrested for anything.
Like somebody stopped for like a crooked taillight
Right.
or whatever, and then asking why I'm
Right.
being pulled over that.
So I've represented a number of people who have been charged with resisting when it started with them being stopped for a crooked something on their car or something, some low-level equipment violation. And you watch the dash cam and they're just trying to understand why they've been stopped, and the officer's mad because they're being accused of stopping someone for no reason. And everyone would be better off if everyone was just more upfront about what's happening and why the stop is being made. But those are the types of stops that, in my experience, are more likely to kind of get out of hand and lead to a resisting charge.
Somebody else? Young lady.
I just was wondering where the link would be, or if there'll be a link for the slideshow that you gave.
We'll have to send
I'm
it.
gonna send it to Dee and she'll send it
to you
around.
guys. When you signed in, that's why we had you sign in, so we can send you this,
Okay. That's all I need to know. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Patrick?
Yeah, I just had a question about the data. You mentioned at one point about people, say, pulling, traffic reports from the courthouse and looking them up on your site. So there's an ID number that would be on any traffic report?
No, so there's two different search features on our site, and I don't know if I have internet here.
Yeah, it's Wi-Fi.
Oh, it's gonna make me long, but basically, I'll just sum it up. There's the advanced search feature, which is just for police chiefs who have the unique ID codes. There's another it's called Find Your Stop.
Right, that's the one I'm at.
So that can work two ways, right? So you're pulled over by the police leaving here this afternoon. You can go on the website, say you're a 40-year-old white male, and and you're stopped for speeding. You can say, there's just a series of fields, and you fill in as many of those fields as you know. You say, for race, you put white, gender, you put male, for age, you put 40, for stop cause, you put speeding, for department, you put Asheville, and then you hit enter, and it'll pull up all the 40-year-old white males stopped in Asheville that day. And then you look for the time that you were stopped, right? And you'll say, okay, I know that's me. And then you click, there'll be a hyperlink there at the end of that list, and that will be the hyperlink for the reporting officer, and you'll say, now I know that that's the officer who stopped me. You click that link, and it'll take you to a page of that officer's career enforcement history.
What's the name of that book again?
It's opendatapolicing.com. Find a stop is the feature, and it's on the front page. But if you want to just spot check, if you wanted to audit Asheville PD, if you wanted to, and so just, if you just want to see, like, are all these traffic stops that are occurring being reported, you're just trying to just test that hypothesis. You could go to the clerk's office and you could pull just randomly speeding tickets or traffic tickets. And you can enter that, all the demographic information for those drivers are gonna be on that traffic ticket. You're gonna be able to discern, is this person who was ticketed, you know, you can discern their gender, age, race, and the reason they were stopped, and the department that stopped them, and the time of day, all from the face of the traffic ticket. So you can just enter that into the website, and either that stop will appear or it will not appear. If it does not appear, it means that that officer did not report that stop as the law requires, because if they reported it, it'll show up on our website. But there is a lag time, so there's about a 60-day lag time between when the stop occurs and when it would end up in my database, because they have 30 days from the end of the month that it occurs to report it, and then it takes a while to show up on the state servers where I get it.
Report it, who do they report it to?
They report it internally to someone on staff at the department who's responsible for getting it to the state, but ultimately it gets reported to the state SBI.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
What they're reporting is, you're saying you could check it by looking at actual tickets issued. But if someone is pulled over and stopped and there's no ticket issued, would that go into your database?
It would, yeah. So
If they
you're
report
not
it.
going to be able to find any written record of it, but if it was you that happened to, so if you get stopped and just get a warning,
Right.
you can still expect to find your traffic stop in your database, because officers report all stops, not just the ones that write citations.
Is that it? Any more? Thank you, guys. I just want to take this opportunity right now and thank folks first before I forget. We want to thank PRC Applications. They did pay for our box lunches, 25 of them that were reserved. We want to thank them for that. Special thanks goes out to Lauren, Patrick, and Jesse. And they happen to also be our backbone as far as code for Asheville is concerned. We also say that not only are there our backbones here, but we do have another project to compile economic demographic data on African Americans here in Asheville. So we've got that summit and that information coming up. So we have some mighty work here to help improve our community, and we look forward to that. We also like to thank Lauren for helping sign everybody in as far as the food is concerned. And to Dolores, who happens to be my daughter over there in that turquoise jacket, thank you for signing everybody in and so that we can send them the information. Thanks to all of our partners and allies who are in this room. You know who we are. And thank you also to Carmen for giving us this opportunity to work through the NAACP to do this work. Mance, I can't say enough about you. You look mighty young, but you're mighty old in spirit. It's amazing. And we've been given this resource. I just cannot believe it. We're going to be using it. Now, the last thing that I want to talk about is a CPAC meeting. And we have someone who is not here today so much in her role as a CPAC member. And I do want to also say that Gwen Whistler, one of our city council people, was here in the room in the beige suit today, seated on that side, right next to Jim. And she left and I was gonna thank her, but anyway, she was here, so we're appreciative of that. So Carol is here today, Carol Rogolf-Hallstrom, who's also with us on the NAACP, but also on the CPAC board. So I want Carol, if you will, to tell us about the upcoming CPAC meeting, because we need support. With that, I'll see it.
CPAC is the Citizens Police Advisory Committee established by the City Council. And while we have no authority, we do try to create public forums for discussion and exchange of issues specific to police-community relations. And in working with the NAACP, inviting CPAC, inviting the work that has been shared with us today to come into CPAC as a public forum, so that the broader community has the opportunity to learn about the data that's available and have some discussion, not just a series of assumptions, but some discussion about areas of common concern. We meet the first Wednesday of every month, so our next meeting, did I do that? February 1st, 5 o'clock, at the Public Works Building at 161 South Charlotte Street. And there will be a presentation, a much condensed presentation of the information shared with us today. The department has been responsive to having some of these preliminary exchanges, to exploring jointly what the data is and what the implications of the data is or are, whichever is appropriate. We probably will not at that meeting, shouldn't have expectations that we are going to come to exactly what the next steps will be, but certainly advancing the conversation, and that happens because members of the public come to observe and to participate. So I would welcome you to be at that next CPAC meeting, to invite others who, in your experience, share concerns about continuing to develop and advance community police relations. So I hope that we will see you then on the 1st at the CPAC meeting, and much appreciation for your leadership on this.
Ian will be making this presentation in condensed form. We do need your support. We need to show up and come with as many people from the community as we can. One of the issues that we have as citizens is that a lot of us work, and a lot of people who really need to be there. This is an opportunity at 5 o'clock, but we really do have to show up. Let me also say that we want to still keep doing these lunch and learns. We're going to probably every other month bring issues out that affect the minority and marginalized communities. And so we want people to have input. The only thing that I would say to you is that they'll probably start at 5 o'clock p.m. rather than at lunchtime. So I just wanted to say that. And are there any other announcements that need to come forward? Yes. Darlene.
Hey, I'm Darlene, also at the NAACP, and I just wanted to announce that there's a NAACP-sponsored film screening that's happening Wednesday and Thursday night at 7 o'clock. One's at AB Tech, one's at the Grove Movie House. It's called Democracy for Sale, and it looks into the issues of gerrymandering and how that affects our everyday lives through various issues that face us currently. So I'll have flyers on the way out the door if you want to grab one.
Anybody else?
Also, in February, Asheville Black Lives Matter will be holding a series called How Poverty Has Meant Death Upon Black Asheville. So we hope that people come out and support that movement as well.
Thank you. Anybody else? Yes, Patrick.
I just wanted to add that I want to thank Colton for filming this. It's
yes.
probably fall off.
Thank you.
But for anyone who's on the email list, I'll put the video on YouTube. We'll send the link out. So if anyone would like to see this but wasn't able to be here today, you'll be able to share it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Holden.
Wow.
You're welcome. Yeah, hard to steal.
One more announcement, you guys.
I just want to quickly alert everybody that next week is People's Transit Week. We know here in Asheville there's great racial disparity between car ownership and those that are dependent on our bus system, and we need to make our bus system better for everybody in Asheville. So if you're into that and want to know more about how you can engage, you can come out for People's Transit Week and have flyers.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you, guys.